Well, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, good night, wherever you are in our lovely absolute world, somewhere, I'm sure. But thanks for joining us live here today for the one and only Serverless Office Hours. We are streaming on live on the AWS Twitch channel, on YouTube Serverless LAN channel, and also via LinkedIn Live. My name is Julian Wood. I'm a developer advocate for serverless at AWS, and I am super happy to be joined by the one and only Brian LeRoux. Brian, welcome to Serverless Office Hours.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be
Well,
here.
I'm excited to have you as well and pick your brains. That's the reason I do office hours, is to be able to talk to all the experts. Brian, you have been a pillar of the serverless community for sort of years. Tell us what's sort of been your journey into AWS, into serverless, and what you do.
Yeah, I've been a customer for a really long time. I'm pretty sure I was there right at the very beginning with the first serverless service S3. And I remember when that launched, it was like, oh, that's such a nice little thing because this part is such a big pain, and didn't think a whole much of it as things like progressed. We started renting VMs and we started building out different kinds of applications the same way we used to by plugging these things together. And my career kind of led me to a point where I was doing a lot of mobile work after iPhone came out, like so many developers. And I was working on a project called PhoneGap, and we were selling training support services to build applications using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And you could target iPhones and Androids and Blackberries and all these different devices. I'm Canadian, so we had to do Blackberry. And at that time, people still used Blackberry, so it wasn't as weird as it sounds now. But
I remember.
we sold a training in Amsterdam, and I got there and there was like 60 people, and all of them had Windows machines, and they were all expecting to build for iOS. Because the pitch was use HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to build, mobile apps for any platform. And so that was obviously a disaster. And that weekend, I built a service where we compiled um, stuff in the cloud, and then we would send you down the binaries like the APK, the IPA files. And we built that using AWS, also a beer fridge full of Mac minis for the iOS compile. And fate had it that Flash kind of fell out of favor, and Adobe wanted to move into the mobile world. They acquired our company, and I found myself doing cloud development against an on-premises kind of centric company. And then they were like, good news, we're going to the cloud. And so we started building out earlier versions of Creative Cloud on top of AWS, moving stuff from on-premises, from literally a beer fridge full of Mac minis into proper data centers, into proper virtual machines. And that journey led me deeper and deeper into sort of back-end dev. And I was at the AWS Summit in 2015 in San Francisco, and I saw the first demo of API Gateway. And it was literally like, oh, that's how we're going to build applications now. Is all this other stuff that we're doing was a lot of work that wasn't really directly related to the work that the value we were trying to provide. Nobody cared how many servers we had in our cluster. No one cared if our RDS was, read write replicas. They just wanted us to compile apps for them. So I was an instant convert at that moment. Like, oh, I can just have someone run, like I give them the code and they figure out the rest. Like, fantastic, because that's obviously where things should go. And I thought this would just be like over immediately. Like, I thought on-premises was gone. I thought this idea of load balancing servers was gone. I was all in. And yeah, that was a decade ago. So clearly we still have a few years to
The
go.
world moves slowly than we expect, definitely. Well, we're going to cover that. In fact, that particular topic, I certainly want to chat to Brian more about that. But before we get back to Brian and all his awesomeness, let's just look back on the sort of previous week. What's happening in the world of serverless? Well, last week on the stream on the 25th, we were talking about the CloudFront hosting toolkit.
Oh, cool.
And this is a way where you can deploy things to CloudFront with all the bells and whistles that you need. So for 95% of you, Amplify is going to be a great option. Begin's going to be a great option as well, as we're talking today. But if this is stuff under the hood that you need to tweak and optimize and this kind of thing, this is another toolkit which can help you. So it's on youtube.com/serverlessland, along with all other Serverless Office Hours episodes. Yeah, a really cool source of knowledge, I think, over the years of some cool serverless stuff. In terms of what's new,
CloudFront's a beast. That is an extremely helpful thing for people to have.
Cool. Like, yes, I agree. I agree wholeheartedly. Yeah, and just in terms of what's new over the past week, as you can see, EventBridge has been doing some cool kind of stuff. There's a new console dashboard which has got metrics. It supports private links, so for EventBridge pipes, so you can connect to EventBridge pipes from within your VPCs. And EventBridge Scheduler adds more universal targets. So that's just using the AWS SDK, including Amazon Bedrock. So there you go, Amazon Scheduler connected to your GenAI applications. That is cool. Some recent compute blog posts. Well, there's the smorgasbord of blog posts, which yours truly has done, called In Case You Missed It, Q2 2024, everything I could gather that had happened in the AWS world of serverless over the past 3 months. And it's a lot. I'm sort of limited by the number of words. Otherwise, the blog post would run forever. But yeah, huge amounts going on in lots of different services, and links to, videos and blogs and serverless days, presentations, and EDA day we had. So yeah, lots of cool information. It's a nice way to just quickly catch up. It is AWS Summit season at the moment. Something's gone weird. Oh, I think I've copied and pasted and messed that up. Sorry about that. But yeah, New York Summit coming up on the 10th of July, and we've just had Japan and Washington. So yeah, free technical content. Some more summits are going to be added to the list hopefully later in the year. Yeah, great way to connect up with AWS, get some free technical content, and have a good day. So today we sort of have a title of Simpler, Faster Serverless APIs, but Brian is just such an expert in all things kind of serverless. I'm actually just going to start with the question, Brian, to get your thoughts on, like, what is serverless in 2024? You were thinking an API gateway 2015 in SQL. I'm putting words in your mouth. But, this was all going to be a quick transition. We're 10 years later.
Yeah.
What do you think of serverless, and what does that mean to you? And is it still relevant?
Yeah. So this is a hot topic, and ever, you ask 10 serverless people what they think, you'll get 10 answers. They'll be similar but not the same. Yeah. And I think early on, a lot of us were enamored with the idea of utility compute being the thing, and so it was like scale to 0 or 100% utilization. These are all fancy words for saying that you only pay for what you use. It's on demand. I think the thinking kind of grew beyond that, and some folks are more in the ethos world. So like we think of serverless as a method for outsourcing. And so if my core competency isn't racking servers, then I most certainly shouldn't be exposing myself to that level of abstraction. I should outsource that to a vendor that does that. And if you take that to its fullest extreme, the value I'm providing is probably the code I write, but not how I go about scaling that globally. And so that to me fits well. Ben Kehoe likes to talk about how it's a spectrum. And so like, maybe for your company, moving to WordPress.com is serverless. Like if you're not running the WordPress blog, then that's kind of a serverless way of looking at things. But I don't think a hard and fast definition. Language changes over time, and that's tricky. I just did a talk at a conference called LambdaConf, and it's more about functional programming than lambdas. But I was one of the guys who was talking about lambdas, and my belief is that we're actually really close to kind of functional programming ideals with serverless, and so we can think about things in terms of function. We can model in terms of limits. We can use declarative formats for deploying those things to get deterministic outcomes. And I was like trying to draw all the like ways I could to bring these things together. I actually have a little website called fwa.dev. They call functional web apps. It's like more of a concrete implementation of serverless. And in that sort of journey of looking into like how the functional world overlaps with the cloud, I was sort of shocked to discover John McCarthy, the guy who created Lisp and discovered lambda calculus. He also predicted utility computing, and I'll dig up for the show notes the slides for you. But he in 1961 he suggested that compute will get so big and powerful that people will rent it just like they do telephone service. And the description is eerie. It's from 1961, and he basically describes where we're at today. And you think, well, this guy's so smart, like how could he predict this? But I think it's just industrialization at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Stuff gets smaller, faster, cheaper, and at a certain point, the economies of scale, especially in cloud, which is a capex game. It's a game where big companies have to spend a lot of money to stand up data centers and stuff. It just makes sense to outsource. If I'm a small food delivery business, it really doesn't make sense for me to put a data center in every town I operate in, and I can just use AWS or something like it.
Yeah, no,
So
I love those sort of
roundabout way of answering that.
no, but I think that's a because some people get very caught up in the terms and definitions and have lists of categories with you, and they sort of say you're either in or out of serverless. And I also, believe in the spectrum, and even forget about the spectrum of just the continual evolution of IT is always making things simpler, always abstracting things away, and serverless is just the sort of road you can walk on that gets smoother and gets simpler as it is, and then you come up to some sort of hill, and that's annoying, and it's got pebbles and rocks and everything, but ultimately in the fullness of time that hill is probably going to be smoothed over and it's going to be easier. And if you want to call that serverless, or if you want to call that evolution,
Yeah.
I don't mind. I'm not here to sell you a serverless or that kind of thing. I just, hopefully the world's going to make it easier to deploy stuff and use stuff and do this weird IT thing.
Lambda is a good example, or S3 is a good example too. But like, I like looking at Lambda because it's 10 years old now, or almost 10 years old. So like, it's very much in the mature technology bucket, very boring, very understood. When it started, we had 3 seconds of execution, and it was billed by the second. Today we got 15 minutes of execution, and it's billed by the millisecond. And sometimes I hear folks say, well, that's not very long, but like that should be more than enough for a single function execution. I would argue if you have a function execution going over 15 minutes, you've done something wrong with your architecture. And what did I have to do to get that capabilities? Nothing. I just sat here doing my thing, upgrading Node once in a while, and my services kept getting better and better and better. Same thing with S3 or and you name it, any of these services. And that's very serverless too. It's an attribute of it. The other day, my certs all renewed. I get notification, hey, all of your certificates from ACM are renewed. How lovely is that? That didn't exist before. I used to have to do that. Like,
I remember that.
yeah. So that's serverless to me. It's you get on you get a lot of benefits, and you get accruing benefits that compound with time. Your investment gets better with time.
Cool. So I know, Brian, you've got some stuff to show us, but before we get there, sort of paint the picture of what is APIs in your world. And I know you do a lot of APIs with Lambda, and Begin is all sort of connecting that and making that simpler. So yeah, faster, simpler APIs. What's the sort of API landscape that people should be thinking of in 2024?
Wow, yeah, it's a good question. I think a lot of where folks are coming from today, or at least the majority of developers, are coming from the perspective of their front end clients, usually. And all the growth in our industry in the last decade or so has been through front end. If you go learn new computer programming bootcamp places, they're going to teach you HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So a lot of API design is kind of following suit these days, and a lot of the way people like to think through things kind of map one-to-one back to your screens and how you think about your application from a visual standpoint. This is pretty heavily contrasted with how I learned about this stuff. When I was sort of coming up in the industry, we thought about things more from a perspective of resources and entities and business relationships. And I don't think there's one right answer or good or bad way to do things here, by the way. I'm not saying one's better than the other, but when I was coming up, REST was still pretty new. XML was the rage. We wanted to think about things in very discrete terms. And we all sort of realized roughly at the same time that most business operations can be kind of reduced to collections of nouns and verbs. The nouns being the things that you're doing, like maybe accounts or orders or whatever, books, maybe in the case of Amazon selling books, and CRUDL operations for verbs, create, read, update, delete, and list, which maps neatly back to REST. Of course, GraphQL kind of came up and maybe is sliding back down as a way to approach APIs. And the other big thing that's changed, I think, in the last 5-ish years has been an expectation of real time. So most API design these days, we can probably reduce down to reads and writes over HTTP. But the expectation now is really immediacy, especially with this LLM, Gen AI, chatbot world. where we're now conversing with our computers, we're expecting immediate responses. We're not expecting to wait a whole long time. And if there's relevant information, I don't want to go to some dashboard to find out, my service is down. I want you to notify me the second that happens, please. And like that should be pushed to my device. So we've kind of got this sort of dueling banjo world where we've got traditional HTTP read and write type business, maybe using 5 verbs, maybe only using 2, depending on how you look at it, and real time, which often is WebSockets and HTTP streaming. And I think between those two, we're pretty well covered from a complexity standpoint. We can do fairly real time stuff. The sort of final boss that appears to be around the corner is local first. And a lot of people are talking about this lately. How can I build applications that are really resilient to offline conditions? And I don't have great answers there yet, but I do know you always need a server probably at the end of the day, or something that looks like a server and acts as your single source of truth. And I'm a big fan of DynamoDB for that job. So it's that's how I'm thinking about it right now. But
Yeah,
stuff evolves.
and that immediacy angle is interesting, because I think we've always spoken about the sync versus async as the sort of way to think about that. And I spoke at a conference recently. I was chatting to Sam Newman, who's of microservices fame, and he was doing a talk at the conference, going, "I don't think you know what that word means," talking about asynchronous. And he was talking about, but there are plenty of things that are asynchronous that you can get an immediate response, and there are many services which you can use WebSockets, and you send some things, maybe a synchronous request, and the whole backend goes and does something, and maybe over WebSockets or maybe even over GraphQL, it's going to update your front end. But you've got no concept that that was an asynchronous process. It was fast enough that it was just a browser update. And so there's this interesting evolution thing where you can do a whole bunch of stuff asynchronously, and that doesn't mean that's the old clunky slow stuff that happens in the back end. For just sending emails or that kind of thing. And so, there's an interesting evolution in this world of responsive web applications or anything behind an API, but with a sort of asynchronous part of it, linking back to the front end. There's a whole world out there.
Yeah, and it's tricky, especially if you're coming purely from a front end perspective. The sort of habit is to think in terms of HTTP requests and call and waiting for a response, and really. It's just kind of like one edge to the whole thing. There's also aspects of coordination. So like I often hear people talking about needing state managers on the client, and I think it's kind of a code smell personally. Like if you need to manage state on the client, then you're probably doing something wrong on the back end. Like we've got really great deterministic tools for back end state management now with step functions and other things like it. So that's a very asynchronous world where it's like, okay, well, I have a business process that's going to take place, and some of that may not be super deterministic, and I want to push that off into the background because I don't want to, halt my front end user experience for this. And so it's like something goes off, goes into the step, and now I'm polling to see what happened, and it's definitely a different way of approaching things for sure. We're also spoiled down, so like. I remember when 3 seconds, I think, was our SLA Adobe, like 3-second response time was good. And now I'm pretty sure if anything's over 500 milliseconds, smells like a bug. And that's wild, because it wasn't that long ago that multiple seconds was pretty much the norm, especially on mobile. We had 3G networks, these crappy phones, you wouldn't expect a sub-second response, but now if it's not sub-second, I think it feels slow.
And web pages are way more complex than they ever were, and part of it's static or server-side front ends or micro front ends, all these kind of things. So your web page may be connecting to 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 different APIs just to gather all the info it needs to just show you a page, which is crazy in the complexity if you think of it, but cool that we can actually do that.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's good or not.
I'm also on the fence with that.
I kind of think the front end should be like sort of a this is just a person. Now we're getting into like kind of opinions, but like I think that it should paint the rectangles and boxes, but it shouldn't really know anything else. Like it should be a fairly dumb process, and any kind of coordination should probably happen.
Well, we are here for your opinion, so that is cool to hear. And you just remember,
Yeah.
we are here live. Love to hear your questions and comments. Let us know where you're from. Rajesh, welcome from Dublin. Lovely to see you.
Hey,
Returning guest Daniel Habib from Brazil. Hello as well.
nice.
And previous good friend Brian Graff. I didn't. Oh, thank you. That's very kind of you. Brian, yeah, Brian used to also, known Brian for many years. A super cool person, a rock star himself. So yeah, great to connect up with other kind of people. So yeah, let us know where you're from. Too many sort of kind of questions. We're happy to take. But so Brian, you are involved in something called Begin. But there's a whole bunch of stuff as part of it. There's an architect framework. There is different kind of deploy tooling. There is stuff to do with infrastructure as code. There's a faster SDK that you're working on as well.
Yeah.
Where do we start, and what is the kind of things that Begin maybe does as the whole sort of thing? And yeah, while people are coming up, I'll just say, never mind, thanks from Seattle, and hello from Amsterdam, schizophrenic web developer. Hi from Amsterdam. Hopefully, yeah, cool.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll give you like the quick pitch. A lot of people are scared of AWS. You shouldn't be, by the way. Like a lot of people are. A lot of people are new to this industry and see the console and the AWS thing as like this big hairy beast that's just really tough to tackle. So Begin's a free way for you to just get your feet wet, try it out. And the difference between Begin and other services like a Netlify or Vercel is anything you build on Begin is portable to your own Amazon account at any time. And that's nice because eventually you'll probably outgrow us, and that's okay to say. And I think you'll want to probably build directly for AWS, even if it's not something that you're super excited about doing because you think it's complicated. It'll be really good for your career in the long run to look at these kind of top or better clouds. So Begin's a quick, easy way to do that. Right now, if you want to get started with AWS, I acknowledge it is intimidating and difficult, but it's very doable. If I can do it, anybody can do it. All you really need is a credit card, which actually is also a barrier to entry for some folks. If you're a young student or something, you might not have a credit card yet. So that's what Begin's for. Anything I show is based on our open source framework architect, which is an infrastructure as code tool at the end of the day. And not knowing anything about who's watching or what's going on, I'm going to explain what infrastructure as code is. So if you already know, I'm sorry. And if you don't, well, here we go. Infrastructure as code is a way for you to describe your dependencies in a deterministic way so that everybody else gets those same dependencies. So if my application depends on S3, and instead of telling someone in the checklist to go set up S3, I've got a little file checked into my repo that says I'm going to be using S3. And then when someone else checks out that repo, they're going to get S3 set up for them automatically. This is identical to how dependency resolution works in popular languages. So if you look at things like Node.js with package.json or Python with requirements.txt, same idea. Infra as code is just a definition of cloud resources instead of code resources you depend on. And it gets checked in with your code. And so that version of that code will work with this version of these resources every time. And that's nice because you get a repeatable process. In the past, we used to sort of follow checklists and stuff, and then inevitably some guy would make a mistake on step 3 and no one would know why the services were out of sync, and it would just create a big, ugly mess. Sometimes you hear people call that ClickOps. ClickOps isn't necessarily bad or good, but if you're on a team greater than 2 people or you don't remember stuff very well like me, then you're going to really like Infra as code because it gives you a way to make sure you have the same thing every single time. Now, the downside of Infra as code, and there's a couple. One, it's an embarrassment of riches. There's a lot of ways to do it. And so you got to pick which way you want to do it. There's AWS SAM, there's Terraform, there's Architect, there's CDK, there's a thing called SST that a lot of people like, there's Pulumi. And any one of these will probably get the job done. They all have sort of different trade-offs. So CloudFormation, verbose, and very AWS specific. AWS SAM makes that a lot nicer for what it's worth, which is like a dialect of CloudFormation, but it's still pretty verbose. CDK makes this really easy, but it's based on TypeScript, which is kind of brittle and maybe is a little bit slow because it has a build step. And so like it might not get the same build every time. And different versions of TypeScript come out. Now you have to rewrite a bunch of stuff. So like it's not as I would say is deterministic, but it'll be more familiar to your developers and give you red squigglies and autocompletes, which is all very nice things. Terraform is probably, many would say, the sort of industry standard way to do things. They've had a lot of licensing ambiguity lately, which I think is troubling if you're an enterprise. And there's serverless framework, which is kind of like a similar to Architect. It's just a higher level YAML file. And that Architect, which is what I work on, which is like a higher level thing. Almost all of these compile down to CloudFormation, so you're probably going to get very similar results. You sort of just have to pick a horse and go with it. So Architect is a way to do this very tersely. And maybe is now a good time to demo, or what do you think?
Yeah, certainly. Let's go for it.
Okay.
So is Architect and Begin also particularly suited to building APIs and web applications? This isn't for data processing or other kind of serverless use cases that people may be doing, even if they are using Lambda or something.
Yeah, that's right. It's designed specifically for web apps and APIs, and it can do anything CloudFormation can do. So if you wanted to build a data processing pipe, and people do. So, am I sharing?
You are sharing. I haven't put it up yet. I think we're on the
okay.
the bit of the inception. So we'll there we go.
Okay.
Yeah. We have echo high.
Yes. Perfect. Slightly smaller. Where I am. Desktop. I'm gonna make a directory called, I don't know, SLS. And I'm gonna run a command called archinet. And this just bootstraps a quick little Architect application. And so this is what we call an arc file. This is our infra as code. We don't have to use this format for whatever it's worth. We can do this in packaged JSON if we wanted. And it's saying there's going to be an API gateway or an HTTP endpoint, and it's going to respond to get slash. And if I look at my folders, I've got this little Lambda function here. Let's make this a bit smaller so we can see the code. And it's going to run Arc Sandbox in the root here. And that's going to kick a web server on localhost 333 over here. And so there's our application running. This is probably a bit of a disturbing thing for folks. They're like, wait a second, you're running this locally? And it started in 11 milliseconds? Yes, I did. One of the things that makes Architect a little bit special is we have a local development environment for all the stuff that we cover. And sometimes people think this is bad. You don't have to use it. You can deploy to staging if you want. In fact, maybe let's just do that. So I'm gonna go here and go to my terminal. So I'm in my folder. I'm gonna just say arc deploy. And this is gonna generate some CloudFormation. If I look now here, it's not there yet. Well, it might delete it now. Let's jump over to my AWS console. I think I was in US West 2. We can see it's already deploying here. Under the hood, Architect generated this giant hunk of CloudFormation, but you don't get exposed to any of that. And so right now it's in the process of doing its thing, generating all the different resources you need. There's a static bucket, there's an API gateway, there's Lambda function, there's all that. There's an IAM role that's scoped to least privilege to the stack that it's in. Jump back over here, still deploying for a second. The first deploy, oh, create complete, there we go. First deploy about a minute. And we can go look at this. Come on. So there you go. A serverless app built and deployed in 1 minute. Kind of cool. Let's just go quickly make a change though. Like, is it Julie Ian or Ann?
I'm AN, but
Okay,
I don't
I
mind.
get this right.
I've got French family connections, so I can be Julian as well.
There we go. So we'll do a second deploy. This one should only take 20 seconds because a whole bunch of this infrastructure was already built for us. And shout out to the folks over in the CloudFormation team because they have been doing, yeah, there you go. Update complete. Over here, 15 seconds. How about that? Like, let's just pause for a second and appreciate that. And sometimes you hear people say CloudFormation is slow, but that is just not true. It is super fast now, and that's magical to me.
Yeah, and the cool thing, and the reason, part of the reason CloudFormation can be slow is it's 100% deterministic. If CloudFormation says it is deployed, it is deployed. So they do a bunch of checks and making sure that it's actually what it is. It's just not like, oh, we've done something and sort of wave hands and everything. So yeah, there's that trade-off between being deterministic and always knowing that, yep, that is deployed rather than not.
And it's been like a bit of a journey, like it didn't used to be this fast, but it only has gotten better. So I just did what's called a dry run, and that'll show you the generated CloudFormation if you need to debug something before it goes up. And I like doing this as a part of like demoing things. So here is on the left our Infra's code, which is 9 lines, 8 really. And this is the generated CloudFormation, 360 lines. There is no way any but human being is right. Maybe Eric could do this, but like,
yeah, not me.
I don't think anybody is writing this by hand, especially not debugging this by hand. So this is really the big benefit at the end of the day is you get this nice terse, tight little language. And again, this could be in your package JSON. We also support YAML. We just like our own kind of almost YAML-y language. So let's do something a little more involved. Post count. So I just added a route, and I'm going to go back over to my terminal and run arc-init. And then I'm going to go back here. Close you. Let's take a look at this. So that just generated another Lambda function for me called post count. I'm going to npm install helper functions. So you don't need these. These are a thing we have to smooth things over that just adds some like niceties. So it's like a very small package. And when you're doing raw Lambda functions, there's like you have to tell the headers and the body and all this other business. So like it gets a bit wordy. So these are just helpers, but you don't need them. Sometimes people are like, "Oh, I don't want to use your thing." It's like, go ahead, don't use it. It's fine.
Yeah, but specifically anything which is returning HTML, yeah, HTML is going to be wordy and headers are going to be wordy, and that's just the way it is.
Yeah, and like
nothing is good. It's simple. It's simple text. Like that, it's entirely easy to reason about. So
right,
I don't have a problem with
that. It's it's a trade-off. So like it'd be nice if I could just do this, and that's all we do. It's like we just give you like slightly less typing to do. But actually, in the case of a post, I just want to redirect back to where I came from. It's like if you're doing a real redirect, you got to set headers and you got to set a proper status code of 302 or 303. So I'm just going to do location equals this. Back over here. From here. Okay, so here we're going to render a form. Just a regular old form. Everyone does a counter demo these days. It's a little faster.
I'm impressed. Handwriting this all in Vim as well.
Oh. Yeah. Well, that's just me dating myself more than anything. Sometimes people are like, "Oh, it's so hardcore," and it's like, actually, this is what I learned, and I'm lazy. So, oops, that's not local. That's deployed. So here's my local thing, and if I hit this, you'll see the URL change. So it did the redirect for us, which is kind of fun, but that's only part of the story. So we
so you wrote the Arc local as well as to run the sandbox locally, and then you're not even having to do that 50-second CloudFormation deploy. It's just available immediately.
Yes. So we saved 15 seconds there. In a bigger app, that adds up. But right now, it looks like a pretty trivial difference for sure. So I'm going to display a variable called count, and we'll say let count equals request.session.count or 0, whichever it is. And let's just pop that here on the button. And if I go back to my sandbox, you can see it says 0. And if I redirect, it's still going to say 0. It's not doing anything. So I'm going to go over to post count now. And I'm going to steal this. And I'm going to say count 1. And add it to the session. So we come with a built-in session. You're looking at it right now, and it's incrementing that value. The session is an HTTP only cookie. It's using a JWT on the client, but we actually have an environment variable where you can override this and point it at a Dynamo table. So often what happens when you start building an application, you need a session to go across routes, and you want to do that statelessly. As the application grows, inevitably, so does your session. You might blow out the limits on a cookie, and so we have a way to do this with DynamoDB. Pretty trivial.
But again, you're starting with just actually storing it locally on the client, so there's no session management or concurrency stuff with Lambda or external state or anything,
right?
To make the client problem.
Exactly. So that's nice, and you can still upgrade to use Dynamo if you need to. And it's just changing an environment variable to do that. So this is cool, but I want to be able to reset my session. So I'm going to add another route for that. Now this is very single purpose functioning. We're doing lots of like individual Lambda functions for individual things, but you could put this all in one Lambda if you wanted to. But the generated CloudFormation for what we're doing is going to put these in separate Lambdas. There's arguments for and against doing it this way. The thing that I like to remind people is if you put things in small functions, there's nothing saying you can't consolidate them later. And the inverse is true too. This is a very reversible decision. If you decide that all this needs to be in one Lambda, your editor is probably very capable of copying.
Yeah, because I mean, there's a lot of talk in the industry of, and it's a term I'm actually weaning myself off of using, is the sort of the Lambda lith kind of thing. Yeah. So I find that people who've done done a good thing, they've moved to the cloud. It could be from somewhere else, and for good reasons. They've built things in a certain way, and they've maybe had a big monolith somewhere, and they've actually then built a few Lambda functions, not sort of every route or that kind of thing, but they've I think done a good thing, built a whole bunch of Lambda functions, and then someone's still telling them, oh no, you're still doing a lith, even though that lith from a Lambda myth is way smaller than the big monolith they had before. And so I don't want to tell people they're doing anything wrong with that. And I think you've got to be pragmatic. I think there are very good reasons to have smaller Lambda functions for security, cost control or cost visibility, but observability, many kind of things. But also the trade-off is manageability. You've got a lot more Lambda functions to look after. That can get complex, and especially if you're a small team and there's not a lot of coordination, having a bigger Lambda function isn't going to be the end of the world. So, as with all consultants, they say it depends. But yeah, I'm trying to move away from the term Lambda lift, because I don't want people thinking, oh no, I've done all this work to go to Lambda and I still have a lift. What's wrong?
Yeah. And it's very reversible. I mean, we're in the process right now of creating a few functions. One thing that I hear people say, oh, but then you got to manage a lot of functions. They're all 23 seconds later, we've got our working counter deployed live. That's kind of cool.
Wow.
Yeah, it's reversible. So I mean, it's kind of like do it however you want, and you'll have to change it later anyway. So it's not a big deal. I think people definitely get a little worked up about thinking they're going to build the perfect architecture the first time. And spoiler alert, you aren't.
Yeah.
Just get building.
But also, the converse to that is you've got way less to worry about or to think about. So you've actually got more time to think about the code that you're writing. And I was actually having a chat to somebody recently, harking back to our earlier conversation about serverless, and they were a DBA and they'd worked, in a data center, and they were doing all DBA kind of stuff. And they said, moving to the cloud, and they were all in SQL, so there was no NoSQL stuff that they were doing. It was all on SQL. And he said to me, look, I don't actually do the serverless thing, but the one thing I've realized is I spend my whole career as a DBA thinking I'm going to do cool DBA stuff. But actually what I'll end up doing is installing SQL, doing replication, doing disaster recovery, backup plans, making sure the backups are working every night, doing dumps of tables, restores of tables for test environments, all that kind of thing. When actually I wanted to be doing was schema management and helping my developers write better SQL queries and actually doing more of the SQL stuff. And so, it was an interesting take. We're talking about code now, but that other sort of serverless spectrum with databases and all other kind of things. People get time to focus on the things, on the value that they can add, rather than stuff behind the scenes.
All that management work ends up being most of the work, and a bunch of that just melts away. I wouldn't say it's gone. Like sometimes people will say,
and there are other things. There are other things that are introduced as well. Things like observability and other kind of metrics you now need to learn. So there are trade-offs, but I still think it's simpler. Just Daryl, thanks so much for joining us again. Yes, hadn't heard about Begin before today, but it sounds like an interesting option in many cases. Yeah, it certainly does. We also had Schizophrenic Web Developer again. I do enjoy the name. Is there a free tier for Lambda? Yes, there is. You get 1 million free invocations every single month per account, and there are some other kind of free things. So you can certainly. Do that. Now, the best thing is when people answer other people's questions. So George Mac408 from Twitch, thanks for joining us as well. Yes, and also take a look at AWS-Amazon.com for free and search for Lambda, and you can get all information there as well.
Architect apps are all composed of serverless primitives that scale to 0 that have generous free tiers. And that nets out to meaning that your app mostly probably runs in the free tier. Like Julian said, you get millions of invocations for free. DynamoDB, you get, I believe, 25.
I think it's 25 gigs and certain requests a month or whatever. Yeah, so a 25 gig table. That's pretty decent.
A lot of app. That's a lot of app. So like you can get very far before you break out of the free tier with these services. I just wanted to show that if you have a folder called public and you've got HTTP defined, this will be an S3 bucket that we proxy from the root. And so there it is, local, but just to show that there's no tricks up my sleeve, we'll deploy this. Oh no, what did I do wrong here? Oh, that's funny. I don't even know.
That's why you can tell we're live on Office Hours. We're doing all the things in real time. That's part of the fun.
Let's do this. Let's see. That's funny. I've never seen this error before. Of course it happens now.
Oh, of course.
All right, well, let me back out here and see what I've done wrong.
That's fine. Now have a look. Yeah, also, we've got more people from Brazil. So, thanks for joining us from Brazil. Brazil in the house today. And we did mention George Mac408. He's from LA. And actually, Schizophrenic Web Developer also had an interesting question earlier. What is the difference between concurrency and asynchronous in programming? My quick definition, to keep it simple and short, is concurrency is parallel processing, and asynchronous is processing after the fact. So concurrency is you have multiple requests coming in at the same time, and they run concurrently at the same time. So 10,000 requests that come in from your website at literally exactly the same time. That's how your website can handle that. Asynchronous is when you tell a service, do something for me, and the service goes, I've got your request, I will then go handle that in my own time. Now, that may be a short amount of time or a long amount of time, but that's hopefully the difference. Brian, anything else you'd add, or you troubleshooting?
I'm troubleshooting, but I think you just nailed it. It basically boils down to, is it on the hot path or not, is what we like to say.
Yep, that's a good way.
Is it user facing? Yeah.
Oh, thanks.
We try and push everything async that we can.
So, but behind the scenes, you were saying, okay, this is obviously running on AWS with CloudFormation. Is this Lambda and API gateway? And you've also added an S3 bucket. Are these the sort of fundamental building blocks that Begin is building on?
Yes. So for us, actually, I'll jump over to the Arc.code's website real quick. So for us, it's all about serverless services. And we don't do the greatest job of explaining which ones, but if you click on Project Manifest in our docs, you can see all the things that we support and all the ways that we support it. And these map roughly to, so HTTP is API gateway. Our events pub sub maps to SNS. If I was to redo it today, I'd probably use Event Bridge, but we predate Event Bridge existing, so here we are. Queues maps to SQS, scheduled maps to CloudWatch events, which is actually now Event Bridge, hilarious. WebSockets, API gateway. S3 with static, DynamoDB for tables and tables indexes and table streams. And that's kind of it for us. We actually only use, I think, something like 12 services total. We have the ability to extend into anything CloudFormation can do, but our sweet spot is building dynamic web apps and APIs. That's what we're designed for. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, definitely. So, so yeah, part of that is there's also web components and functionless and WASM. I mean, that's also in the mix. I know some of the things you've been talking about. Or am I going through that field here?
No, let's get into it. So
before we do that, you were talking about S3. So you were just by having having public, that was then going to set an S3 bucket, which you could then store images or store any kind of stuff, or people could upload things into your S3 bucket as well, I suppose, if you coded that up.
Yeah, and I don't know. I think I broke my deploy using I did. We have a bug which I'm going to have to hassle my co-founder about, but you'll have to believe me that it works. If you have HTTP and you've got a folder called public, normally this will just deploy to S3, but it'll proxy through API gateway at the root. So you can build a traditional static application that talks to an API. And the nice thing is that API will be same origin. So you'll be on the same domain as your S3 bucket is and your API. So you don't have any CORS issues when you do this.
Everybody gets happy.
Yeah, that can be a pain. So if I did like a kitchen sink thing here where I had WebSockets, I had an event, I don't know, and maybe I had SQSQ called Q. This will set up API gateway WebSockets. This will set up API gateway, respond and get foo. This will set up SNS ping. This will set up a queue. Oops, I gotta save this. Review. So if I run arc init, that'll generate all those Lambda functions for me. And these are just functions, like they're just boring old JavaScript functions. You can bring whatever dependencies you want and do anything Node can do in there. It's great. And then AWS takes care of the scaling side, which if you've ever tried to run your own stateful WebSocket server, you will know that this is much nicer way to do things. I'm not, well, maybe I will deploy. I was going to say I'm not going to deploy this. I'll do a quick dry run. We can just see the generated CloudFormation. Oh man, I have really borked this setup. I don't know what I did wrong. Copy you, and I'm just going to start fresh. I don't know what I did. Let's do make dir SLS2. Debug this live elsewhere. And arc. Okay. Regenerate everything. You can see how fast the iteration speed is. Anyway.
Yeah, no, exactly.
It's pretty quick. So now, if my system isn't totally bored. Oops. Oh man, yeah. I don't know why. Hydrator is busted. It worked no problem when I just did basic stuff. figure that. Ah. Okay, so that worked for whatever reason, but there's nothing else in there. So let's add WebSocket. Let's see. Did work.
Do you not need to do another init though?
Okay. Oh, you're right. Oh no, I didn't need to because it was sitting here already.
Okay, the file. So the init just creates the files, but
Yeah, and it's not very smart. It creates files if they don't already exist. And by the way, if you don't like our directory structure, don't worry. You can remap everything. That's possible. Okay, so process of elimination, slowly arriving at a working example here. Actually, don't know what was broken then, but
yeah,
cool. Way to go, JavaScript. Good demo. All right, so that's the CloudFormation now to have one SQSQ with a Lambda function, one SNS of topic with a Lambda function, 3 default WebSocket handlers, and one HTTP GET handler. 1,000 lines of CloudFormation. And let's see how long that one takes to deploy. This is a brand new, fresh deployment to CloudFormation. Oh no, this isn't. This is going to update the existing one, I think. Yeah, it is. In progress, so we can see it's creating all these resources for us. By the way, CloudFormation really isn't intimidating. It does seem that way at first, but once you start getting used to it, it is a wonderful way to work. And you can see all these individual resources are now getting created for me. It's just going to go through and do each of those.
Basically, each of these resources is backed by a Lambda function, and then within that Lambda function, it's going to use the SDK to do whatever it needs to then interact with that service.
Yep, exactly. And so we used to do all this with the AWS SDK, which is kind of a nice segue. These days, we're working on our own version of the AWS SDK. We call it aws-lite. There we go. It's done. Deployed in 48 seconds. Here's your HTTP endpoint. Here's your WebSocket endpoint. Bob's your uncle. Yeah. I don't know of a faster way to do that. And I also don't know of a way other than local stack to get this working locally, including the WebSocket stuff. So it's a pretty powerful thing.
So tell us about the local story, because obviously, there's a storied history of this, that local stuff is hard with the cloud, with AWS, because mocking a whole bunch of stuff locally is hard. And so, for years, even myself, I've been pushing people to try and get in the cloud as quickly as possible, because it's just going to be easier, safer. We know it's not necessarily going to be as fast, but you basically you're not mocking, you are using live cloud resources. But
right.
Things like Architect and things like Begin, you are able to have a really great local story. And I know you are, within the realms of APIs, but
right.
And you don't have to mock everything. So yeah, I mean, this seems like just a really simple, and I don't mean simplistic. I really mean just a simple, easy way to be able to, code APIs and still have that really great local experience.
It used to be a major advantage. I would say now that we've got deploy times sub, 1 minute, this is less of an advantage. But the good news is AWS doesn't break. They don't change their APIs. They don't ship breaking changes. Stuff that was built 10 years ago still runs pretty much identically to today, for good or ill. And we depend on that. So mocking AWS is pretty safe. I don't think you can say the same for most other clouds, especially the front end clouds. They break pretty frequently. So we depend on that stability in order to get our local dev experience. The local dev is obviously it's ripping fast. It's only 12 milliseconds. We to start this thing, and that's because we work the same way as Lambda does. We don't invoke anything unless you request it to be invoked. So yeah, it's a quick, easy way to work locally, but I recommend having staging environment. You still should be deploying to the cloud and using these live URLs and live infrastructure to verify your infra. But for just getting your quick first passes done or your screens done, working locally still can't be beat. This is where the real testing happens, though, is in your staging stack. And that's actually also worth noting. I've been deploying, but you'll notice it calls it SLS LAN staging. And that's because by default, when we deploy with Architect, we deploy to a stack that we postfix the name staging to, and we add an environment variable that says it's staging. You want to deploy to production, you got to do arc deploy dash production. It's a very explicit step.
Explicit.
Yes, and it will generate a completely new stack. And so SLS production is not SLS staging. And this is what you really want when you're building out an application. Ideally, you also don't want to be manually deploying. This should probably be happening using CI/CD, either GitHub Actions or code build or something like that. So this is a bit of an opinion we have. You should have a staging environment. You should run tests in that staging environment if you can. And you should have a production environment, and they should be totally divorced stacks of identical resources. So if you do have an issue, you can reproduce it in staging, verify that it exists, fix it in staging. By the time it gets to production, you're not worried about whether it works or not.
Yeah, the production is just another deploy once all the most of the things are ironed out.
Yeah, and it's identical to staging. And so, it's this is just this isn't even us. This is just how CloudFormation works.
Cool. So, I mean, to reiterate, all of this is running on AWS with serverless services under the hood. It's just going to wrap everything and make it simpler. You did also mention aws-lite. We didn't get to look at this, but this is a very stripped down JavaScript SDK. For many reasons of history and compatibility, the AWS SDK, can get big. And so, Brian and the team have put together aws-lite to make that a little bit easier. We just have one question, and then we are running out of time. But a schizophrenic web developer again, do you use Lambda layers for shared dependencies? Brian, no. I don't think you do for Arc. And I would just caveat that, saying we literally have seconds to say that Lambda layers are great for sharing dependencies, but not for sharing dependencies just between a few different Lambda functions. I think Lambda layers are awesome when you have software that you package up, or it's an artifact or something that you want to share between organizations, share between teams, and all kind of things. If you have software dependencies that it's just an npm install or a pip install, and it's not going to be super huge, use the native package managers. I think that's going to make your life much easier.
Yeah, we have a concept called a folder called shared. Everything in shared gets copied into all the other Lambdas.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
And we recommend layers for binary dependencies. So if you have something that's shared across your app that is binary, and you want to compile it, that's a great thing for a layer. But I wouldn't use layers for code dependencies per se.
Cool. Perfect. Well, Brian, thanks so much for joining us. I can't believe the time has gone so quickly. Yes, next week up, before we say goodbye to Brian, we're actually talking a bit of serverless containers, so ECS and Fargate. I'm actually away for a few weeks. I've got some work travel and then some holiday vacation coming up. So Mesh is going to be hosting next week. And then we've got a crew of other cool people who are going to be chatting to you about various serverless services. Don't forget serverless.com for all your info and stuff on serverless. And then lastly, but certainly not least, Brian, thanks for sharing your knowledge and your wisdom.
Yeah.
I love how Begin just makes web applications so much simpler. So look at Begin, look at the Begin website, and I'm sure we will be catching up again soon. And send Brian and myself any of your questions. And for the rest of you, same time, same place next week. I won't be there; others will. But thanks so much, Brian, for spending time with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Cheers. Bye-bye.